Gentlemen, and now for the event you've all been waiting for. We are here today to listen to Brett Marquard talk about Argonaut USCDI and US core efforts. Take it away.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, everyone. Hopefully got a little break at lunch and you're ready to roll. You haven't hit the slump yet. So I'm Brett Marquard. And I'm a consultant with Wave One, and my background is in EHR interface and integration, and somehow I found my way into standards. And we all have our unique roles in the industry, and I currently view mine as how to write usable standards that actually get implemented. And so through that, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in the Argonaut Project since the beginning, as the editor of the Argonaut Data Query IG and some other projects, and then also US Core. But it's really unfair, to talk about this just as myself. My kind of partner in crime, who's not here today, is Eric Haas. He is the, brilliant fire community member who, in terms of making the spec super readable, he writes the best fire guides around. And so, if you ever get a chance to meet Eric at the fall work group meeting and other spots, make sure to think of both of us when you think of US Core. Okay, before we get into the presentation, one of the, why does US Core matter? There's lots of good reasons, but one that comes up is it's required in our current KEERS update certification rule, which means every EHR in the country that chooses to go through the certification program, which is most, because payment gets kind of messed up if they don't, is required to deploy 3.11 this year, later this year. So it's, there's prior requirements to implement an open API and provide documentation. This is an actual named version of the US Core standard. So that's one of the reasons it matters. It's not the only reason the standard matters, but you'll learn more about that as we go. So we'll talk a little about US Core and the Argonauts, importance of profiling, US Core profiles, USCDI, and future of US Core. For those who have been here on Argonaut, I'm going to give the 2 or 3 slide introduction to Argonaut for folks who may have missed that, but then it'll be quick and we'll get going right away. So first off, what are the Argonauts and the Argonaut Project? The Argonaut Project formed to accelerate the adoption of fire and OAuth in healthcare. It was kind of born out of this JSON task force, this kind of big report written in the US about the state of interoperability not being realized and new work needed to be done. So this report triggered this community to say, hey, we're going to get together, we're going to form a coalition, and we're going to work competitors, across the industry to define kind of a common way to access kind of key clinical data elements. A few quick things: it's private sector initiated and funded, creates open implementation guides. If you've watched the whole history of Argonaut, we didn't actually run everything through HL7 in the beginning. We just published it to the web and people could use it or not, and that was okay. But kind of through feedback, some folks have encouraged us to run it through the standards process, and that's what HL7 is really good at. There's lots of rigor and process and comments. It's a lot of work, and so that's something that we've done with more recent guides, as that's been important. We're not a community that is shy about borrowing other work or using or improving. So whether it's SMART or CDS hooks or anything, we're happy to plug in to accelerate those efforts. So we're not a standards organization, not a legal entity, proprietary activity. Here's the mix of vendors: strong EHR participation, some consumer with Apple, consulting, payer, and then some really strong provider organizations that have given us kind of clinical input along the way. And I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to pull those providers in at times throughout the design cycle. Ideally, the entire time, but make sure to proactively reach out if you're in to get that critical feedback of making sure the spec meets their needs. In terms of the team, this is the current team. I'm serving as project manager. Josh Mandel, brilliant, smart architect. Josh and Gino are both from Microsoft and are what we kind of call in-kind contributors to the project. They spend a ton of time, leading, develop reference implementations, promoting. Incredible. Dan Gottlieb and Eric are both independent folks. Dan does a lot of work with Boston Children's and Harvard, and on bulk in terms of the current Argonaut initiatives. And then Eric has worked on US Core and other things throughout the year. Yeah. Okay, so that's us. And why does Argonaut matter? So Argonaut, signature event is this data query implementation guide. And so this was the first kind of published artifact that the Argonauts did that provided, kind of profile guidance, search guidance, a whole bunch of guidance to actually use the Fire API. For folks who've read the Fire spec, it's well, depending on which version you've read, it's huge, right? So there's all kinds of search. There's more resource. Like I feel like every time I open it up, a new resource grows, and so which is something that's that's good growth of a standard. But this guide, was the first, really concrete direction on how we expect folks to implement it, and provided guidance to something called the Common Clinical Data Set, which was a data set that ONC, if you look at regulation back 10, years, ONC over time has started to kind of publish like, hey, here's the kind of common set of data elements. So it's like the MU data set, and then this is the name, the Common Clinical Data Set. The current flavor is the US Core Data for Interoperability. So you've heard that term. We'll see it later in the presentation, which is a set of data elements and classes that ONC promotes in implementation of both the FHIR and CCDA standard, and it requires adoption across the industry. But anyway, the guide provides some guidance on using OAuth, and there was a little bit of guidance on how to actually, if you wanted to request a CCD via FHIR, that was all included as part of this spec. And this spec kind of took off. This became kind of the de facto standard across the industry for FHIR DS22 access. So if you're working with a DS22 server, there's a pretty good chance that they've either know of the Argonaut project or are influenced in some way by this guide. How does this relate to US Core? US Core is actually, I consider like the formalization of the Argonaut requirements and kind of some external inputs. So it's formally validated, it's published. There's been, it's been 5-ish years since Argonaut Data Query Guide, but the kind of underlying approach is still kind of is baked in the US Core. So it does support this thing called the USCDI. It's widely adopted by the US industry. And I think one of the things is you'll see us throughout this presentation when Argonaut started, and then kind of the initial version of US Core was like, oh, this is provider access or patient access to data. And so that's kind of how the spec was written in mind, like how to give providers and patient access. But as we, within the HL7 community, it's this broad set of stakeholders, payers, public health, quality, all these folks are trying to develop kind of content profiles. And so over time, the spec has gotten, in some ways, a little bit more genericized. So it's not just focused on that use case, but allows so people can pick up and reuse these profiles. And you'll see this in 311 in the slide deck here. We had requirements for race and ethnicity. And it's something that the US government requires for certification. EHRs need to capture and collect it, but that's not something payers necessarily want in other use cases, or public health is allowed to collect. And so the 311 spec has it as kind of this must support thing, but in future versions, you'll see we relax that and remove some of those requirements and kind of move them to narrative text to say, hey, if you're doing certification, be aware ONC is going to ask you to do this additional thing. But we've removed it kind of from the formal HL7 profile so that other use cases can pick up and build on it, because we want it to be, and we've been, I think, promoting it as the baseline. I shouldn't say we've been promoting it. It's becoming the baseline for kind of US profiles across the industry. Fun fact, there was a data access framework project a long time ago. If everyone heard that, it's fun. Okay, so Argonaut DS22 versus R4. You'll see a growth of some profiles here. This is for folks who may have built, on the prior one. The addition of, clinical notes was in here. Provenance, clinical notes spent almost a year kind of developing guidance. So if you look in the core FHIR spec, there's not concrete guidance on how you access clinical notes. And that was added to through Argonaut and US Core. And that was the first time it was, formally published. Guidance on pediatric vital signs, smoking. So this is your list, just 27 profiles, that's it. Okay, so why don't we take a peek at some of the key parts of the specification. So we'll look at profiles, why do we care about profiles, and then some of the other kind of pieces as you go about navigating the spec. So first off, kind of the importance of profiles. So FHIR is 10 years old, and when the first kind of conversations came out, it was, hey, we don't need profiles. Like, the resources are discrete, there's good definition. Like, you'll pick up patient, I'll pick up patient, you'll pick observation, we'll be good. Like, we'll maybe have to, they're discrete enough. You don't need profiles. Maybe you need to do some terminology work, but just expose your capability statement, which describes what your server supports, and we'll be able to interoperate. And pretty quickly you learn that it doesn't work. It works to an extent, like you could download the patient resource and do a little bit of, but the idea is that without profiles, there's just, divergence in how people approach the resource. Observation is a resource that there's, I think in US Core it's growing, there's over a dozen kind of observation profiles for the different nuances of like, How do you do oxygen saturation? Well, there's a lot of different ways that people are interested in doing it. What's the one way we can at least agree to it? Like method, room, oxygen content, pressure. These are really important things for certain use cases. But when you go to the outpatient office visit, they don't necessarily collect all that, and it's not necessarily relevant for all the exchanges. And so let's agree on exactly how these things are done. And so then you could build from there for more specific kind of clinical models. And just give you another kind of parallel, like this is the base condition resource. So the condition resource is used to capture problems. You can flag things as diagnoses. There's lots of good elements here that the modeling within HL7 community has agreed need to be on that base resource. You'll see almost all of them are 0 or 1. A little hard to read from far in the room. And let's just dig on a specific element. So condition code tells you the type of condition it is. And if you look at it, it's a codable concept. So you can insert kind of a code in a code system. You can use SNOMED there. And so it indicates the type of condition, problem, or diagnosis. And if you look at that, there's kind of this nice word here. Can't walk away here. There's a value set there, problem, diagnosis, or condition. And then it says example. And example, how much use does that provide to someone? It provides a few example codes, but doesn't point to any kind of like formal requirement, terminology requirements go with it. So you just compare this to what we've actually agreed upon within the US core specification is we have, 5 elements that we believe are a priority that every server needs to support. Clinical status, verification, category, code, and subject. And that covers the key parts of that condition resource. And the way the spec is built is this is the differential view. And so these are the things that we've added additional guidance to. It could be something as simple as adding that must support flag. You'll see the binding, how we have clinical status codes required. We have some things that are extensible, which means if it's not in that particular, if there's not conceptual coverage in that value set, you can add what you need. But there's actually kind of terminology tied directly into it. But if you were to click to the full view, you could see all the base FHIR elements. So we don't constrain out and say, hey, at this time, we don't kind of disallow elements. You can use the full power of the resource underneath. It's just a selected set that we constrain and quote profile. You'll notice in the links on this particular presentation, just to note, there is a link to STU 311. So it's intentional throughout the spec, this presentation, that we link to the 311 version of US Core, but there have been 2 new releases, 4.0 and 5.0. And so if you're brand new to the space, you don't necessarily relate to certification, I would take a peek at some of the future versions and see what we've done. We've improved some of the definitions, a little bit more in conformance. There's some good stuff there. And most of the kind of core requirement, and there's some kind of new profiles in there too. All right, so let's actually talk about the US Core profiles a bit. In each profile, we have this kind of sample narrative description, mandatory must support elements, profile specific guidance. Why does this profile matter? And so, we spent a lot of time saying, here's an example usage, mandatory elements, must support, and then this profile specific implementation guidance. I can't say enough, don't ignore that little blurb of text, because we give some guidance like, oh, hey, there's some nuances in how systems do encounter diagnosis. Some vendors do it this way. Because we couldn't nail down one way to do it and profile it, that little block at the bottom is very important to read. And this was like, hey, how do you do no known allergies? It's a common use case when for folks who don't have allergies, that systems just capture no known allergies. And so the very explicit guidance on how to do that, because that wasn't in the base spec to try to encourage consistency. Must support. Gosh, I'm blanking if there's a whole section on must support. How many folks feel really good about what the word must support means? Okay, there's a few. Well, first off, it's a little red flag. You see, like there's a little red. Oh, there's a delay here. Sorry. There's a little red S. Okay, don't ignore that S. Okay, that little S means a lot. It means a lot that we've added a whole page to the specification to try to explain it. And I apologize we've added a whole page. I wish we didn't have to. The way it kind of started was must support is your system. If your system is capable of this, capturing this element, you got to expose it. And that was like a pretty simple definition. And folks said, well, what if my system doesn't ever support it? can I say I support it because I don't ever support it? Because your definition has this loophole in it. And so you can imagine us kind of like spinning on it. Because, all right, if you never support it, then okay, we'll kind of give you a pass. And as it's evolved over time, it's gotten pretty restrictive to say, like, if it's flagged with this S, you have to prove that you can actually capture that and return it on a request. All right, so it's not required on every exchange, but it's just you actually have to prove that you can do something with it. Okay, there's different views and profiles in Fire. There's a text summary, which has kind of gone away. There's a little bit of kind of quick summary in there. The differential view is what most profiles open up to, which is the elements that have been profiled. And then there's this tab called Full View. It got renamed to Snapshot View somewhere along the way, but that's the thing. If you click the Snapshot tab, you'll see all the elements that are in the resource and that are available for you. And then all views just kind of expands it all into a huge page you can scroll through. On each page, there's this thing called a quick start. And this is the supported RESTful searches. And this, again, it's funny to talk about like how much thought, it's hard to see in this particular moment. This is like, how do you request all the patient's allergies? And if you were to look at the base Fire specification, you'll see there's all kinds of power in the search. Like, you can search by allergy type, you can search by date ranges, there's probably a dozen different kind of searches that base Fire supports. And a lot of servers go way beyond what we put in the kind of quick start section. But as we work through the Argonaut process, kind of learning that, hey, if we don't explicitly specify kind of a core set of queries that folks are all going to support, it's really hard to know, as a client app developer, like what can you actually rely on? And so we've built that, we've baked that into the spec, we baked in the capability statement. Servers who go through certification have to support the searches, the ones that are marked shall. And you'll see we're pretty light touch and kind of give some shoulds on things that a lot of servers do support. And this has grown a little bit over time, but it's definitely one place to peak if you're a client app developer. Okay, US Core versus USCDI. Okay, inside the spec, there is a mapping between the two. And again, USCDI is the US Core Data for Interoperability. And when it was considered to be version 1, which I think was published, oh man, time is a blur right now. So it's 2022, I don't know, 2019-ish sometime in there. Someone can correct me if that's totally wrong, but it was a while ago actually. But this includes a mapping of what our expectation, and I believe the certification uses to support this particular ONC data class. Here's the kind of corresponding profile to go with that. And we've improved this over time. This was just our first kind of crude mapping that we added to that specification because we kept getting asked for it. It was a good question. To meet USCDI, you'll see extensions for race, ethnicity, and birth sex. An extension is a Fire extension is basically, your ability to kind of insert an additional element or feature inside the resource. And so if you were to click on that, it takes you to kind of a different structured definition, like a different kind of mini profile that gives the terminology guidance. And for race, there's like a OMB5 category code and a more specific code and exactly how you send that information. You'll note in this particular view, all those are marked as must support. Future versions have removed that must support to allow better reuse. And then you'll see kind of US realm terminologies tied in at the appropriate spots. So birth sex, there's a very constrained list of elements that policy required us to include. I jumped in. So in the quick start section, you see in this particular case, there's actually a requirement to support patient name search, a string search. And in each of these two, you can look, we did try to give pointers back. And this is where, tip of the hat to Eric to always be saying, hey, how do we reference back to the base spec? Because some folks don't even know what search by string means. So hopefully if you're in the quick start section, you can find a link back to like, hey, here's how you search by string in the base Fire specification. And you can see examples there. There's examples everywhere. Okay, so terminology. There's 20 plus value sets. If you don't have a plan to manage terminology as a Fire server, like that should be high in your list. It's incredibly complex. At this point, we're doing our best to publish. So, terminology. So it's, this is a whole set of the value sets, and I'll show a few examples here. So it's just a collection of concepts or a definition of things that are expected at a given slot in the, or a given element in the specification. So, US core procedure codes, all the procedure codes that are appropriate to go inside the procedure profile in the code element. And so there's kind of two ways that value sets are built in the FHIR specification. They can be kind of compositional or intentional. And basically what you can do is you say, so, it's US core condition. And in that key part over there, it says include code. So what you're doing is within SNOMED, it's saying include codes where concept is a clinical finding. And so that looks like a really innocent statement, but there's like tens of thousands of codes behind that statement. All right. So you got to think about like, how am I going to import that? And right now it says, oh, value set's too big. Only the first 1,000 are shown here. So there's ways to get this. There's a value set. Over time, we've improved how to get this. So the Value Set Authority Center is one place. Value Set Authority Center, VSAC, is provided by the National Library of Medicine. It's an awesome tool. You have to get the login. It's kind of an interesting process to get it's a UMLS license. I won't try to tell you what the acronym for UMLS is right now. Stop. But every year you have to fill out a survey to get access to SNOMED, and they do a lot of cool stuff, but you do have to log in to get access. And so there's always this tug and toll, like we've always wanted to put it directly in a FHIR specification, but there's licensing rules behind it. In the US market, our government pays SNOMED a large chunk of money to have access, because it's a lot of work to curate these terminologies, and some of them are free or kind of have grant funded link, and others, but understand that there's reasons behind that, and you can't yourself just post those to the world. But anyway, you need to have a process to be able to ingest that and handle updates happen. Codes get retired, new codes get added, something to be thinking about. In some cases, we actually directly enumerate the value sets in the specification. So this one was a smoking value set. There was a policy requirement on these very specific terms. Don't read too, I mean, they're just given to us. And so then inside the spec, we explode those so that someone can just see them and start doing development on them. Okay, inside the spec, there are these things called capability statements. There's one for the client, one for the server, and this describes, if you were doing US core, there's an example one here of, if you were doing everything in the spec, what you actually support. Every FHIR server is required to have a capability statement that can be requested so that a client app can see what a particular server can support. So just jumping into the capability statement narrative, you can see here, and inside that, you'll see like section by profile. Again, we're trying to be very explicit about like what is actually expected if you support this resource. So you give you the idea of exactly the types of searches are required. You got to have that search on patient ID, the ability on name, the combination birth date and name, and then a whole bunch of shoulds that we encourage folks to support. We do, occasionally we've gotten flack in the past that to be US core compliant, if someone says, oh, I'm US core compliant, you literally have to support the patient plus one resource, okay? And it's written that way intentionally just to allow strong reuse. And within the US market, again, if you're doing certification, the rule says that you use 311, but it's paired with this USCDI concept. So you have to support all the things that are named in USCDI. But yeah, so check out the example capability statements. Okay, so how you hear me talk about this USCDI thing, this US core thing, how do these two really relate? Is there a direct kind of one-to-one correlation? And my not equal sign is already up there, so you know that it's not a direct equals that US core directly equals US CDI. And there's good reason for that. So sometimes we're not perfectly in sync, okay? ONC doesn't tell the IG developers, the community, we would, to kind of be directly in sync, ONC would have to kind of secretly tell us what they're going to publish in USCDI, and we'd have to somehow build the ballot through HL7. But there's kind of this process where we are almost always balloting a little bit behind ONC's publication of USCDI. And when we do that, we typically add what ONC has requested, but we also add things that we think are important. And importance could be additional communities have tested. So, the Argonaut is considered an accelerator at HL7. There's other accelerators at HL7. There's the Gravity Project working on social determinants of health. If they've done some really good testing with their community and they come to us and say, hey, we got 3-4 EHR vendors. We got some clients that are testing this thing. It'd be helpful for us to roll that into US core so it gets greater visibility and everyone can start adopting it. We'd say, great, let's add it. So every time US core ballots, we add and it grows a little bit organically. And then ONC publishes a new rule or publishes a new version of USCDI, which is fun in that it kind of generates, focused energy, but it creates new work. And at that point, USCDI has more things than what is in US core. So US core published the end of May 5.0. There's this kind of standard version advancement process. I'll talk about in a moment. But so we think US core is in a good position to be adopted by ONC at some point. But ONC is also going to drop, we expect, USCDI version 3 this summer. Okay, there's no date, but the expectation is, July or August, we'll see a new release. They've given us hints, for folks who follow that process, that like coverage will be added. Coverage is a great resource. So if you're looking for that, like we could standardize how we'll do that. Maybe some more social determinants of health information. We'll see, but that will kind of be another kind of kickoff point to new design and development. So the way I think of it, and it's like this constant game of leapfrog, and you can see how happy the frog is, like hopping over each other. It's more fun when we're doing the hopping, I think. Okay, this is a crazy slide. It's but I feel like you should see it from me first, or if you haven't seen it, let me talk you through it. So this is ONC's standards version advancement process, and what this is, our government can drop these like big regulations, but it takes a very long time for them to publish them. There's a lot of there's typically an NPRM notice of proposed rulemaking, which receives comments, and then they publish, and it's on this kind of like long cycle. No, can't say it's 2 or 3 years, but it's not something they do every year. Okay, and so what they built into the KEERS update rule, or maybe it was a KEERS rule, was basically this thing called SVAP, which, hey, we're going to name a standard, and then if there are future versions of that standard before we do our next rule, the national coordinator has authority to name that, and EHR vendors can then migrate to that new version. And so this allows kind of like a sub-regulatory kind of advancement for the community, so we're not all stuck on some prior version. So ONC actually has not done this SVAP process yet. I shouldn't say I haven't done it. They're in the middle of that process. And so if you look at, so there's 2 kind of blocks here. So the top block is all USCDI. And so USCDI is on this cycle of every January. It's funny, I'm looking to make sure what I'm saying is accurate because I'm doing it from memory, but every January, they will publish a draft. And so if you look to January of 2022, ONC will prep the draft for V3, or so they'll prep it in the fall, winter, publish it early in 2022, get feedback, and then they'll finalize it in July. And I say all this, it is July of 2022 is coming up. So very soon we'll have USCDI version 3. And then they'll repeat the cycle. So version 4, and this is a really cool process because it helps give you a sense of like, where is ONC headed? And they actually are, I think, been very good about collecting input from the broad community. That's the top bar. On the bottom bar, you have this kind of standards version advancement process. And it was kind of a, I think this will stick, but originally there was talk of the SVAP process being a winter cycle. But the standard, when they publish USCDI version 3 in July, it takes a fair bit of time to kind of build a standard that actually has some testing experience. And so we're a little bit off cycle, but I think we're on cycle now where the SVAP process will always happen after kind of some key standards are published, with the idea that maybe ONC will include them. Maybe they'll delay because they're too immature. We don't know. But you'll see on the bottom cycle, the SVAP review is going on right now, and they'll hopefully name the most recently published standard, and then they do it all over again. So I know it's a lot, but basically the whole idea is you don't, if you're stuck in the regulatory world, like you can advance if you choose to. And also, if you don't choose to, but you're like, hey, we're not ready to move on, but we can see what's coming. Like this gives you some indication of what they're thinking. And before you didn't know, like it would just kind of drop in your lap, and a lot of work would ensue. And they also, ONC did this great thing. They added this, it's called OnDeck, ONC data element class submission system. And so you can go submit data elements that you think should be included in their USCDI process. And not only do I think it's interesting for you to go submit things, but if you're curious of like what is being considered, they actually classify the data elements they receive as comment level 1 or level 2. And so you can go there and see, oh, this has already been submitted. This is a level 2. Or if you really want to promote something, you could say, hey, I've implemented this with my customers. I have experience, and you could help promote it into kind of the USCDI. So that's one way to get to US Core, is kind of the working through ONC, regulatory, promotion. Other way is like at HL7, it's a little bit of stairs here of like, declare you think US Core is the right home for a data element, get published, pilot. I can't say enough, pilot. If you're not testing it, you don't know how it's going to work in the real world. And then you can then propose it to this committee at HL7 called US Realm Steering Committee and US Core, and then it could be included through a ballot. And so that's the example of Gravity or some other accelerator or some group doing a ton of work to include it. Or you can just write a new law. That's what ONC does. Okay, but the Argonaut other communities here are on the bottom. And then again, I apologize. I'm realizing like there's a lot of these huge timeline slides, but just so folks kind of get the rhythm in their mind, US Core will publish roughly every May, and then there'll be a design cycle roughly every fall. And so we'll see this new USCDI publication, version 3 in July, and then we'll do this design cycle. So there's a lot of things going on here, but you can see the 5.0 publication, and then kind of this industry testing, and then a January ballot. And for folks who, just out of curiosity, who's actually ever participated in HL7 ballot? All right, there's a few folks. All right. It's an interesting process, but it's basically, you get to give very specific feedback to fix the standard, and then there's this kind of 30-day window for comments, and then kind of a reconciliation period where the committees at HL7 actually go through every single comment and work through and resolve and make sure you agree, and you can vote negative till the end. They can eventually vote you off the island if you're totally crazy, but the idea is to kind of come to a compromise. All right, so just a little bit of kind of future versions from 3.1 on, additional 90 trackers, a huge migration to that value set authority center, and then this new conformance page. And if you want to read must support, I would highly recommend going to the US Core 4.0 or 5.0 spec, because we spent a ton of time trying to clarify it. We also do this kind of funky thing where the profile is kind of considered structure versus the API, which is like the interaction. And so instead of having those kind of all baked in as like, oh, you support this whole thing, we split them apart so that other products in HL7 can say, oh, I don't want to require search by name. I don't want to require all these other things because my use case doesn't require it. So we split them apart so you could just adopt that content, or you could adopt the whole enchilada and try to provide guidance to that. And then the most recent one, added support for USCDI version 2. So this is 5.0, which was published 2 weeks ago, another 100 trackers, an incredibly detailed change log. The feedback we've gotten over and over again is like, please be very specific about what's changed. So there's a whole page that lists every change we've made, and we try to keep pretty meticulous to keep it up to date. And again, continue to improve the conformance and guidance section, because what's happened is folks have started to go through the certification process at ONC, and when vendors go to get certified and they're told they're doing something wrong, I genuinely believe they're making their best effort to understand the spec, and just, they come to Inferno, they come to us, and we try to clarify it to make sure that the spec is written as clear as possible. And so again, improve conformance and guidance. I'm sure the next release will say more improvements in performance and guidance. So it's a continuous thing. And for folks who do, who are familiar with the HL7 process, 100 trackers every cycle on a ballot is a lot. And you can view that as like, oh my gosh, you guys can't write a spec that doesn't get 100 trackers every time. And the thing my internal monologue in that is like, people really love us. Like, they keep telling us like how great we are by telling us all the things we need to fix. Like, it's getting attention. It's a good thing. So don't ever think that trackers are bad. I feel like going through this presentation without mentioning Inferno would be a failure. So there is a certification testing tool out there that ONC sponsors MITRE to develop. It is a pretty great tool. You can download it, run it locally. You can run it to the kind of API criteria. One thing I think is really fun is they have a little Fire resource validator, where if you're doing connectathon testing or some really basic work, you just copy and paste your resource in, you upload the IG you're testing and hit validate. You don't have to have anything installed on your machine. You just pop it in there and run it. Really simple. And it gives a pretty good output. Okay, so what's the future of Argonaut US Core? the big thing is we don't want to reinvent the wheel for every use case. We see a lot of power across the variety of use cases coming from a common set of profiles. And within HL7, folks have embraced this and have been building on top of these profiles, which is a really wonderful thing. We do expect within Argonaut to host some summer design sprints. So if you're a Fire server and interested in how that's going to take shape, let me know. I think that will probably be August. We'll see. It really depends on when ONC publishes it and how much time we get to do some initial review. But the idea is they'll be likely at the Connectathon in September, and then to prep for kind of the January ballot. These are the other Argonaut projects. If you're interested in these, there was a presentation this morning about them, but I thought you should know that we have a bunch of kind of activities going on this year to try to further advance interoperability. And within the Argonaut community, we think of ourselves as building like foundational standards, which enable a whole set of use cases. And these are all kind of in that line. All right. Some of you may have seen this before, but I always think at HL7, Fire, DevDays, Connectathons, whatever, we're always thinking about like discrete data. And so I still in my mind struggle a lot with like discrete data versus narrative data. And so I like to make folks go through this little exercise with me when I talk about US Core. I call it the Tug of War. And so this is my child of, well, he's a lot, that was 7 years ago. But his name's Edison, and this was Daycare. So for the kids who have daycare or don't have daycare, he would come home and I'd have this little app, and throughout the day, you get this like alert, hey, he pooped or he ate and he napped. And at the end of the day, you go pick up your kid and like, you feel pretty good. Like, oh, I got this good information. Like he took a good nap, good chance he's in a good mood. But you couldn't actually answer the question, like, how was his day? Like, did he like, if he bit another kid, like he'd probably get a note, but like, you don't know a lot from this. You could infer, but you don't know a ton. Okay. So at another daycare, unfortunately, we moved a bunch. We've settled now, but one of the daycares, and this is a long, I'll read it on Edison. We got this narrative in different school. Hey, today after school or after returning from walk, Edison told us he wanted to put away the boot bin. I told him he could help if he got undressed, but he dawdled. I reminded him a couple times that if he wanted to put away the boot bin, he would need to get undressed. He chose to watch other children roll on the floor. So eventually I let him know I was going to invite other children to put away. He got very upset and he actually cried. We have seen similar experimental behaviors medicine, so working with him to link his actions to consequences. As he remembers things from the past, we hark back to those moments to explain why we should cooperate and do as we ask. And so the idea is like you get this, and you're like, oh, you can have this kind of experience with the child or the patient about like what actually is going on in their world. You don't just have this like discrete piece of data. And I do think, someone, had some conversations. There was a talk about turning unstructured data into discrete data, which is a really powerful thing, and I think important. The idea of like, how do you capture the patient's story within this whole thing? You could stitch some of it together with data, maybe more than, I'm trying to expand my mind to think maybe there's more you could from discrete data, but the idea that, listening to what the patient needs and making sure your app accounts for that being an important thing. And then another daycare, like this is what we got. Like nothing. Like weeks would go by and like you might get a little, you might meet the teacher in passing for 30 seconds, but that was it. And honestly, this is a good healthcare example too, right? Sometimes you show up, I just moved from Massachusetts to Minnesota, and like information did okay, but it wasn't nothing, but I'm sure you've all had that experience where you've either brought in a paper chart or they have just nothing on you. So don't lose the story. That's something to just, yeah, so US Core is all about discrete data. There is kind of ability to do narrative, but don't lose the story. And part of this is we did add clinical note access, so you can, get access to that history and physical or progress note within the spec. So Argonaut participation, we're open, we're welcome. We take, any feedback. The best way to get in touch with us is through the Argonaut Zulip channel or the Confluence page, which is kind of always being updated. The contacts are there. Any Gino, Dan, Eric, Josh, we're all pretty friendly and happy to chat. Yeah, that's it. What questions do folks have on US Core or the Argonauts?
Thank you, Brett. Before I start running the microphone around, I wanted to start with a question that came in very early. How will US Core adapt to the information blocking EHI definition, changing from USCDI V1 to EPHI?
EPHI. It's interesting. So for folks who don't know, EHI is electronic health information. It's a requirement that all EHRs have to roll out next year, which is basically they have to give everything to the patient. So the HIPAA right of access right now is you can go in and request everything and you get things in paper, but so there's no requirement for it to be electronic. So next year, you'll be able to get everything electronic, and the EHR will provide the USCDI part standardized, and then the other part in whatever format they want, and they just have to give you kind of a data dictionary definition file to go with it. In terms of how this affects US Core and USCDI, it's interesting. We talked a little bit about like how do we grow US Core to add things, but kind of the current pace of how USCDI is growing is about right. Like, you know, ONC has asked about adding more. And for me, I think it's, you know, important to have really good definitions so that things do make the standard that we all agree on. And we know there's always going to be this slope of things that aren't easily well standardized across platforms. And so we just have to figure out how to deal with that. So, you know, we'll roll more things into US Core, but it will never cover all of EHI.
Not seeing any hands up yet. Let me go to the next question in Q&A. When a new version of the USCDI is released, what can the healthcare data community, for example, providers, patients, and researchers, expect in terms of when vendors will be compelled to make those resources or elements available, and who enforces that compliance?
I mean, customers are, I mean, in my experience, obviously it helps to be a bigger customer, but you know, the vendors do respond to their customer requests. And if you have a specific clinical use case where you need additional information and it's in USCDI, it's a strong case to point out, hey, we're trying to do this thing and there's this new regulatory flashing light out there or brick wall you're going to run into. Why not release it to us early? You can't, unfortunately, I mean, compel or force, like, you know, it's tricky. I don't think there's necessarily a way you as a, yeah, you can bug ONC to move faster on the regulations. I don't know, but yeah, talk to your customer.
Next question. Sorry if you covered this, I joined late, but how do you manage having to deal with different versions of US Core tied to different US CDI, particularly when US CDI V1 is still the mandate version for CMS and allowing voluntary US CDI V2 compliance?
It's a really good question. And I think between V2 and V1, we were tried to be very careful to remain compatible with the prior releases so that we're building and expanding, not, you know, swapping out a value set or making something that was required optional. And that question just reminds me that this is something that we'll be even more into. Like, I would say we were careful, but you know how you're careful and you still like, I think going forward, this will be something that we may make like a requirement of the spec that we're expanding and building. And so it'll be almost like parts of it will be like pseudo normative or locked in because of this kind of need that folks want to build and be able to access prior versions. And they know when they access prior versions, they may not get all the data because we've expanded it in new ones.
All right, time for another conjecture. Does anyone know when USCDI V2 will go into effect?
Does anyone else want to answer that question? Yeah.
So the answer would be no.
Let's.
Summer of this year.
So December is version one.
December, excuse me.
December is version 1. For version 2?
That's what I've been
Yeah.
waiting for.
Yeah.
So Matt Ron, ONC. So right now, USCDI version 2 there's no lever for version 2 right now. If we include it in SFAP, which we're planning to release at some point this month, then within 60 days or 60 days after that, it will be available to voluntarily update to USCDI version 2. You know, now we're still reviewing whether or not to also include the US Core and CCDA IGs that go along with that. So if that also comes into play, then those 3 you could utilize to update your product. That is voluntary. Whether it becomes required in the future, that remains to be seen via a regulation at some point if one comes out.
All right, Lynn.
Okay. Next question. Okay, here we go.
Trustee, is there anyone in the room? No in the room? Okay.
Do we, oh, we do have a
go
hand.
on.
Because Brett will have an opportunity to answer the online questions after the session is over, and we have 1 minute left.
Yeah, so sorry, this is kind of a general question. I'm a terminologist, kind of a junior terminologist, and I'm just wondering, I was just looking at the terminologies that are in US Core, and some I'm kind of surprised to see, and some I don't see there. I'm just wondering generally, what's next for terminology in US Core? Like, what are current challenges, and what are any upcoming changes that I should know
Yeah.
about?
Yeah, I think easy access to code systems continues to be a challenge. And some of it, like for CPT, like how do you, there's licensing through AMA, and in the spec, we're always doing this song and dance of like, well, we can't include in the spec, and you point to VSAC. I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, I would make the link to VSAC something that you don't log into. Like there's actually a relationship that has been built in the US market that like everything in VSAC, or maybe you've logged in somehow to the HL7 spec, and so that login could be passed, but then it's like, well, geez, you want to make people log in and see fire. So sorry, I'm babbling about login to VSAC because it drives me crazy. It drives other people crazy. I've gotten around it. It's really easy for me, but I know everybody else is like, why do I have to do this? So embedding terminology directly in the spec or making it one click away would be like that'd be like a dream. So how's that for dreaming big?
Keep dreaming.
Yeah, thanks.
So we've reached the end of our time. Thank you, Brett, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, virtual and in person, who has come to attend today. The slides will be available in Whova within the next day or so, as will the recording. And Brett will have the opportunity to answer the remaining questions, of which there are a few,
Okay.
on Whova after the session.
Okay.
Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.